Say there, did you hear the news? Sacco worked at trimming shoes. Vanzetti was a peddling man, and pushed his fish cart with his hand. Two good men a long time gone. Two good men a long time gone. Sacco and Vanzetti are gone. They left me here to sing this song. Sacco's born across the sea, somewhere over in Italy. Vanzetti born of parents fine, drank the best Italian wine. Sacco sailed to sea one day, landed up in the Boston Bay. Vanzetti sailed the ocean blue and landed up in Boston too. Two good men's a long time gone. Two good men's a long time gone. Two good men's a long time gone. Left me here to sing this song. Sacco's wife 3 children had. Sacco was a family man. Vanzetti was a dreaming man. His book was always in his hands. Sacco earned his bread and butter, being the factory's best shoe cutter. Vanzetti spoke both day and night, told the workers how to fight. Two good men a long time gone. Two good men a long time gone. Two good men a long time gone. Left me here to sing this song. I'll tell you if you ask me about this payroll robbery. 2 clerks is killed by the shoe factory on the street in South Braintree. Judge there told his friends around that he had cut the radicals down. Anarchist bastard was the name Judge Thayer called these 2 good men. I'll tell you the prosecutor's name, Katzman, Adams, Williams, Kane. The judge and lawyer strutted down, they done more tricks than circus clowns. Two good men's a long time gone. Two good men's a long time gone. Two good men's a long time gone. Left me here to sing this song. Vanzetti docked in 1908, slept along the dirty street. Told the workers organizing on the electric cherry dyes. All you people ought to be like me and work like Sacco and Vanzetti, and every day find ways to fight on the union side for the workers' rights. Well, I ain't got time to tell this tale. The Dixon Bulls are on my trail, but I'll remember these 2 good men that died to show me how to live. 2 good men's a long time gone. 2 good men's a long time gone. 2 good men's a long time gone. Left me here to sing this song. All you people in Swasso's Lane, sing this song and sing it plain. All you folks that's coming along, jump in with me and sing this song. It's 2 good men a long time gone. 2 good men a long time gone. 2 good men a long time gone. Left me here to sing this song.
Mussolini, Sacco-Vanzetti, and the Anarchists, The Transatlantic Context, by Philip V. Cannistraro, Queens College, City University of New York. In The Big Money, 1936, John Dos Passos reminds us that for left-wing militants, the execution of Nicholas Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti on August 23, 1927, defined the political discourse of the age by polarizing society into 2 nations. On one side of the Great Divide stood the popular, progressive social elements that had fought to save the 2 anarchists from the electric chair. On the other side were arrayed the reactionary forces that sustained the capitalist order, from American nativism to Italian fascism. Vanzetti, who anxiously followed the rise of Benito Mussolini's fascist movement from his prison cell, had arrived at the same conclusion, believing that the judge who condemned him and Sacco wore the American face of the conservative interests propped up by Italian dictator. The choice, Vanzetti believed, was either fascismo or revolution. Mussolini did not see Sacco and Vanzetti in these stark ideological terms. As the Duce of fascism and as dictator of Italy, reasons of state shaped his policies toward the case. Moreover, even as the leader of a radical right movement engaged in a bloody war against the left, he admired the anarchists, whom he believed were morally and politically superior to socialists and communists. As late as 1934, he continued to speak at Sacco-Vanzetti in a way that suggests personal sympathies for them and for anarchism, attitudes unrecognized by historians who emphasize his unremitting crusade against the left. The two Italian anarchists had been innocent, he protested indignantly to a friend, but the fascists in America did not lift a finger to save Sacco-Vanzetti. The socialist ranks among the emigrants, anarchists, and maximalists did much more. Mussolini remained proudly attached to the memory of his own radical past, and his reactions to the Sacco-Vanzetti case can be best understood in that context. Although his intellectual formation was largely the product of Marxism and revolutionary syndicalism, Mussolini was also influenced by anarchist ideas. The anti-fascist historian Gaetano Salvemini thought he was more an anarchist than a socialist. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, had been a member of Bakunin's Anarchist International in Italy in the 1870s, and admired both Carlo Caffiero and Andrea Costa, two of its principal chieftains. During his youthful exile in Switzerland, he had known Carlo Tresca and other radicals, and he maintained a lifelong respect for the anarchist leader Errico Malatesta. Mussolini also knew his anarchist literature, including the works of the German individualist anarchist Max Stirner and the Russian anarchist communist Peter Kropotkin. He even translated anarchist works from French and Italian, including two of Kropotkin's major books, Parole d'une Révolte and La Grande Révolution, 1789 to 1793. Nor was the Sacco-Vanzetti case the first instance in which Mussolini reacted to political repression in the United States. As a young radical, he had bitterly attacked the capitalists of the United States because of the execution of the anarchist martyrs of the Haymarket Affair in 1886 to 87. When reformist socialist Filippo Turati accused Gaetano Bresci, the anarchist who left Paterson, New Jersey in 1900 to assassinate King Umberto I, of being insane, Mussolini defended Bresci as a hero and blandly described tyrannicide as the occupational hazard of being a king. Later, as a socialist editor in the Romagna, he again railed against the violent and brutal bourgeoisie that dominated the United States, where two Italian industrial workers of the world, IWW leaders, Joseph Fattore and Arturo Giovannitti, faced murder charges resulting from the Lawrence textile strike of 1912. Mussolini had then tried to rally Italian workers as part of an international protest in support of the two labor activists, much as anarchists would do later for Sacco-Vanzetti. Sacco-Vanzetti's defenders dismissed the notion that Mussolini tried to save the two anarchists, and some have even argued that he secretly encouraged American officials to prosecute them. In 1927, the anarchist Raphael Schiavona charged that, in spite of his public statements, Mussolini told U.S. authorities privately that execution would be fully justified. In the 1950s, Howard Fast, in his novel The Passion of Sacco-Vanzetti, perpetuated this picture of a cynical Mussolini playing a double game. Sacco's grandson, Spencer, believes that Mussolini told President Coolidge that he did not want Sacco-Vanzetti returned to Italy. Recalled one Italian American, "If there had been another government in Italy at the time, Sacco-Vanzetti would not have died, but Mussolini washed his hands like Pilate." Scholarly opinions hold that Mussolini was complacent and uninterested in Sacco-Vanzetti's fate and made no representation on their behalf. But without access to recently released Italian records, scholars could not have been aware of the full scope of Mussolini's activities or of his real attitudes toward the case. The impression persists that the dictator made only one perfunctory effort to help Sacco-Vanzetti, in the form of a private communication to American Ambassador Henry P. Fletcher, written shortly before the execution, in what Mussolini described as a letter of an absolutely confidential nature. He urged Fletcher to prevail upon Governor Alvin T. Fuller of Massachusetts to commute the death sentence, arguing that clemency would reveal the difference between Bolshevik and American methods, and would avoid creating two leftist martyrs. Neither the partisan nor the scholarly views is correct. Italian involvement in the Sacco-Vanzetti case began in 1920, but it consisted largely of reluctant gestures by a liberal government that had long shown deep-rooted hostility toward anarchism. In the 2 years before Mussolini took office in October 1922, none of the liberal prime ministers issued a formal protest against the treatment accorded Sacco and Vanzetti, nor did they appeal privately to American authorities. Yet although Mussolini's repression of the anarchists at home after he came to power represented continuity with liberal policy, he actually did more than his predecessors to assist Sacco and Vanzetti. During the struggle for power between 1919 and 1922, while his black shirts battered the socialists in the streets, Mussolini simultaneously extolled anarchist revolutionary fervor and publicly favored the cause of Sacco and Vanzetti. As prime minister, he reluctantly tempered his support for the defendants so as not to antagonize American sensibilities. But behind Mussolini, the diplomat lurked a one-time revolutionary who harbored an instinctive solidarity with two anarchists trapped in the judicial machinery of a plutocratic state he had once violently excoriated and continued to detest. On both sides of the Atlantic in 1919 and 1920, a climate of right-wing reaction prevailed, a climate marked by political violence and widespread social unrest, in which Italian anarchists were the target of much of the repression. In the United States, the Italian community included Carlo Tresca and Luigi Galliani, as well as followers of Galliani, such as Sacco and Vanzetti, among the ranks of foreign-born anarchists. But Italian-American anarchism was already caught in the last stages of a cycle of government suppression that had begun with the American entry into World War I in April 1917. When federal agents cracked down on radical groups in a mounting wave of repression, the Red Scare in America reached its height in the Palmer raids of 1919 and the deportation of alien subversives. In Italy, the period 1919 to 1920, known as the Red Biennium, also witnessed a rising tide of left-wing radicalism that climaxed in the occupation of the factories. The liberal government stood by while Mussolini's newly formed black-shirt squads launched a bloody war against subversives, and then replied with a police crackdown against the anarchists. Galliani and his chief disciple, Schiavina, were deported from the United States along with 7 others, arriving back in Italy in July 1919, 4 months after Mussolini had founded the fascist movement. But they maintained close contact with their American comrades, and in January 1920, using money collected in the United States, they revived in Turin Cronaca Sovversiva, the anarchist paper that had been suppressed in New England. That September, in the heat of his tirades against the socialists, Mussolini invoked Galliani as a radical of high principle who could testify to his charge that maximalist socialist Giacinto M. Cerati had, while serving as editor of the New York-based Il Proletario in 1902 to 1903, betrayed the subversive code by informing police authorities of Galliani's whereabouts. By reopening the old polemic, Mussolini hoped to further divide the left and gain anarchist support in his struggle against the socialists. In December 1919, Enrico Malatesta returned to Italy from his exile in London. Mussolini immediately saw Malatesta as introducing a new vital element into the revolutionary possibilities of the moment. From 1892 to 1918, Italian anarchism was an almost insignificant element in politics. Today, no longer. Today, Malatesta is the star that obscures all the leaders of the Socialist Party. His influence on the Italian working masses is extremely powerful. Malatesta soon launched a major anarchist daily in Milan. Umanità Nova and Galliani's followers in New England, including Sacco-Vanzetti, raised funds to buy a linotype machine for the paper. Mussolini began to contrast his respect for the anarchists based on their willingness to act, while others only talked, and on their personal courage, with what he described as the do-nothing rhetoric of the socialists. "We are always ready," proclaimed Mussolini, "to admire men who are willing to die for a faith they believe in selflessly." Mussolini's admiration for the anarchists was sometimes reciprocated, especially by young anarchists who saw him as a vigorous leader. In sharp contrast to the socialist politicians they too ridiculed. For a time in 1920, Mussolini courted the anarchists, so assiduously that some speculated that he was about to join the movement. Uncertain of his own ideological direction, he could even exclaim, "For we who are dying vestiges of individualism, there is nothing left, but the religion, by now absurd, but always comforting, of anarchy." When the government tried to cut off the supply of printing paper to Malatesta's Umanità Nova, Mussolini offered him stock from his own Popolo d'Italia, but the offer was refused. As Malatesta pushed for a united revolutionary front with socialists and Republicans, Mussolini became convinced of the growing political importance of anarchism. In order to prevent this leftist alliance, Mussolini tried to drive the wedge between the socialists and anarchists deeper. He grew more concerned over news of a possible alliance of anarchists and socialists with the poet-soldier Gabriele D'Annunzio, whose legionaries had occupied the city of Fiume in September 1919. Alarmed that this unlikely combination might seize power, Mussolini exposed the secret discussion in his own newspaper. The long ordeal of Sacco-Vanzetti began amidst continued anarchist violence and government repression on both sides of the Atlantic. The two men were arrested on May 5, 1920, on suspicion of having participated in the murders that accompanied a robbery at a shoe factory in South Braintree, Massachusetts. In June, while Vanzetti was being tried on charges of having taken part in a separate holdup in Bridgewater, an anarchist-inspired insurrection broke out among military units in Ancona, where the disorder threatened to spread until the movement was crushed. News of Vanzetti's conviction on the Bridgewater charge first appeared in Italy in the pages of Cronaca Sovversiva. Sacco and Vanzetti were both indicted for the South Braintree murders on September 11th. In retaliation, Mario Buda, one of their Gallianisti comrades, he described the two as the best friends I had in America, struck back at the American authorities. Buda was responsible for the explosion that blasted Wall Street on September 16th, and after escaping the police dragnet, he left the United States and made his way back to Italy. Within weeks of his return, a violent engagement took place between police and anarchists in Bologna, followed by a bomb explosion in Milan. These incidents led the liberal government to arrest some 80 anarchists, including Malatesta, and later Galliani and Schiavina. Cronaca Sovversiva was shut down, never to reappear. Schiavina fled to Paris and eventually went back clandestinely to the United States, where he edited the Gallianista paper. La Dunata dei Refrattari, New York. With the mass arrests and the subsequent collapse of the occupation of the factories in early October, Mussolini was moved to speculate that even the anarchists had begun to lose their hold on the workers. And while he claimed to take no pleasure in seeing the aged Malatesta in jail, he expressed satisfaction that the arrest of the Duce of Italian anarchism has not greatly moved the proletariat. The Italian public first learned of the Sacco and Vanzetti case while the two anarchists awaited trial in Massachusetts, and Malatesta languished in a Milanese jail without formal charges. After contacting prominent Italian radicals, Fred Moore, Sacco-Vanzetti's attorney, sent the young left-wing journalist Eugene Lyons to Italy to stir up public opinion. From their prison cells in Massachusetts, Sacco and Vanzetti kept abreast of events in Italy. Vanzetti expressing his belief that my comrades in Italy will not deny me their support. Lyons arrived in November with letters of introduction for socialist leaders, including Leone Mucci, a deputy from Sacco's hometown in Puglia, and Francesco Saverio Merlino, an attorney who had once been a leading figure in the anarchist movement before becoming an independent socialist. Merlino, then preparing to defend Malatesta in court, agreed to serve as the Sacco-Vanzetti defense attorney in Italy. Lyons also met with Sacco's brother Sabino, a reformist socialist whom Lyons described as a mighty fine fellow and devoted with all his heart to Nicola. Lyons placed articles about the case in leftist newspapers and helped to set up an Italian organization to coordinate efforts with the Sacco-Vanzetti Defense Committee, just formed in Boston by anarchist Aldino Felicani, who incidentally had met Mussolini in jail in 1911 when both were serving time for protesting against the Italo-Libyan War. I have little doubt, Lyons reported, but that a nationwide agitation for the two boys is in the making. To Sacco and Vanzetti, he sent word that their friends in Italy, particularly those who are in America, are interested in and speak of them in high terms. In December, Mucci and Michel Metalasso, another deputy from Puglia, raised the issue on the floor of Parliament, charging that Italians in the United States were being persecuted for their political beliefs. The Sacco-Vanzetti Defense Committee intensified its publicity campaign in 1921, sending letters and a leaflet to Italy detailing the frame-up and stressing that the two men were being condemned because they were anarchists. The committee solicited contributions and asked friendly Italian newspapers to publish the leaflet. In the Romagna, Mario Buda organized rallies, and Malatesta's Umanità Nova published articles about the trial. In the midst of these activities, Mussolini continued to demonstrate his ambivalent attitudes toward the anarchists. On March 1922, an anarchist named Biagio Massi was delegated by comrades in Piombino to kill Mussolini, whose black-shirt squads were responsible for a mounting wave of bloody reaction. Instead of carrying out the deed, however, Massi confessed his mission to Mussolini, who placed the young man under his protection. The very next day, Mussolini denounced the government for having kept Malatesta in prison without a trial for more than 5 months. With the anarchist movement in disarray following the arrests, Mussolini felt secure enough to call for Malatesta's provisional release, arguing that a Malatesta danger does not exist. But as Mussolini penned these lines, anarchists became the center of a storm of controversy when Milan was rocked by a powerful explosion at the Teatro Diana. The blast killed 21 people and injured 172. 3 young anarchists had planted the bomb in protest against the government's treatment of Malatesta and his comrades, who had begun a hunger strike in prison. Feeling the pressure of the tremendous outcry that arose against the anarchists, both among the middle classes and among the hardliners within his own fascist movement, Mussolini reversed his previously indulgent stance and sprang to the defense of the established order. Fascist squads destroyed the editorial offices of Umanità Nova, as well as the Socialist Party's Avanti, and attacked the syndicalist headquarters of the Unione Sindacale Milanese. Denouncing the barbaric act, Mussolini blustered the innocent blood demanded vengeance. In the reaction that followed the Diana bombing, Italian authorities expelled Eugene Lyons with the tacit approval of the American embassy. Lyons left Italy on May 25th, just as the Sacco-Vanzetti trial opened in Boston. Italian consul Agostino Ferranti, concerned that Sacco and Vanzetti's anarchist beliefs would hurt their case, insisted on portraying them simply as criminal defendants. And when he visited them in prison before the trial began, he urged them to avoid appearing subversive in court. Ferranti also seems to have gone to Judge Thayer's home in Worcester to explain the Italian government's position, which he later described to a reporter this way: "The Italian authorities are deeply interested in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, and this trial will be closely followed by them. They have complete confidence that the trial will be conducted solely as a criminal proceeding, without reference to the political or social beliefs of anyone involved." Ambassador Vittorio Rolandi Ricci assured Italians in Boston privately that his government would do everything it could to help the accused. On July 15th, the same day that Malatesta was found innocent and released from prison, Ferranti reported the guilty verdict to his embassy, along with his own opinion that Thayer had been prejudiced. The defense committee immediately sent telegrams to Rome, and within weeks, communist and socialist deputies raised the issue again in Parliament, taking a different approach. Socialist Alberto Malatesta asked the government what it proposed to do for the protection of emigrants. The General Confederation of Labor telegraphed to President Warren G. Harding, protesting the proceedings. In response, the government of Prime Minister Ivano Bonomi ordered Rolandi Ricci to take every possible step toward the American government to secure a pardon for our nationals, Sacco and Vanzetti, but it then decided to wait until the appeals process was concluded before making a formal request for a pardon. From Villa Folletto in northern Italy, Vanzetti's father sent a personal appeal to Bonomi, who received no response. Enrico Malatesta, now editing Umanità Nova in Rome, called on Italian workers to make their voices heard loudly in every way possible. At first, he argued that Sacco and Vanzetti had been found guilty because they were anarchists, but then he recognized that a more effective tactic would be to project them as Italian emigrants who were mistreated by foreign governments. As anarchists, they are devoted but modest militants. But in addition to being anarchists, they are also Italians. They belong to a rejected and despised people who can be murdered without concern. Will the patriots of Italy allow that? Unlike Sacco, who seemed resigned to his fate, Vanzetti was optimistic that the impact of the Italian protests, "The Italian workers," he wrote to his sister, "have our lives and our liberty in their hands, because they have the power to make tyrants across the ocean tremble. Even the government of Italy will be forced by the pressure of public opinion to intervene seriously." In Italy, anarchists joined with socialists, communists, syndicalists, and Republicans in protest meetings, the first of which took place in Rome and Bergamo in late September, and in Milan and Bologna on October 2nd. Over the next 3 weeks, rallies were coordinated in more than 60 cities. The liberal government, worried over the strength of public sentiment, refused to issue permits for the use of public facilities, confiscated leaflets, prevented organizers from marching, and ordered prefects to protect American consulates and citizens against possible anarchist violence. A second smaller wave of demonstrations took place in January 1922, while protests were also held in a dozen countries, in Europe and Latin America, and bombs were planted in Paris, Lisbon, Rio de Janeiro, and Marseille. Telegrams demanding justice for Sacco and Vanzetti from local worker organizations flooded the American embassy, some containing threats of violence. In Rome, the Arditi del Popolo, an armed leftist group dedicated to fighting the fascists, declared that it would kill all American diplomats in Italy should Sacco and Vanzetti be executed. But although most of the Italian demonstrations were peaceful, they had the effect of inflaming the already raw tensions between fascists and radicals. For 2 years, the level of fascist violence had risen steadily. By the spring of 1921, Lyons had found that the guerrilla war waged by the fascists was making agitation in favor of Sacco and Vanzetti difficult, and Malatesta had begun to write with concern about the civil war that was ripping apart Italian society. Mussolini found it increasingly difficult to control his black-shirt squads in the provinces, where they were beating and killing socialists, anarchists, and other radicals without distinction. In many instances, therefore, the Sacco-Vanzetti rallies became occasions for confrontation between left-wing activists and local blackshirts. While anarchists and socialists combined attacks against fascism with speeches on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti, fascist squads counter-demonstrated, organized marches, and threatened violence. In Massacra, an anarchist stronghold, organizers at first agreed to let the secretary of the local fascio speak, but then refused him entry, and in Pavia, both sides took part in a public debate. More often than not, police had to keep the two factions apart in order to prevent bloodshed. The tensions between Sacco and Vanzetti's radical supporters and Mussolini's blackshirts was complicated by the fact that the fascist movement had been undergoing an ideological transformation from its original left-wing program to the more rightist orientation of the provincial squadristi. Indeed, the blackshirts had already forced Mussolini to abandon the truce with the socialists he had signed in August 1921. Despite the attitudes of his more intransigent followers, however, the Sacco-Vanzetti case reminded Mussolini of the Ettore Giovannitti affair that had so stirred his radical imagination a decade earlier. Nor could his instinct for propaganda fail to recognize that in the plight of the good shoemaker and the poor fish peddler facing the electric chair, the left, and especially the anarchists, had found an energizing symbol around which to rally their forces and influence public opinion. Personal inclinations, therefore, combined with political instincts to persuade Mussolini to make a public stand in favor of Sacco and Vanzetti. It was Malatesta who, having appropriated Sacco and Vanzetti's Italian nationality in the campaign to save them, showed Mussolini the way out of his dilemma. At a meeting in Milan on October 31st, Mussolini presented the following motion. The Central Committee of the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, while in no way intending to associate itself with the demonstrations staged by those extremist elements, enemies of fascism who exploit the situation to increase their demagogic propaganda, formally invites the Minister of Foreign Affairs to be vigilant and to take action to prevent these suspects and innocent men from being condemned, as has happened before, merely because they belong to the Italian race and the Italian nation. The program of the newly created Fascist National Party adopted the following month, containing a provision calling for protection of Italians living abroad. While Mussolini now supported Sacco and Vanzetti, the liberal government continued to try and quiet the protests in Italy, ostensibly to prevent anti-American sentiments from hurting the chances of a favorable appeal. Behind the scenes, the Foreign Ministry cooperated with Moore in securing a postponement of a deportation order for Frank Lopez, a defense witness who worked for the Defense Committee. From Rome came the order that, at the opportune moment, nothing must be overlooked in obtaining clemency. But when a socialist deputy protested the expulsion of Lyons and the government's failure to help Sacco and Vanzetti, Rome responded that the radicalization of the case had worked against the defendants and that Lyons had been invited to leave Italy because of his subversive activities. Ambassador Rolandi Ricci underscored the government's position, reporting a growing sense of American irritation over the foreign protests. When Judge Thayer eventually denied the first defense motion, Ferranti blamed the deplorable agitation. Toward the end of 1921, the Defense Committee issued a public criticism of the Italian government for the first time, and Vanzetti became convinced that Rome was working against their interests. Some members of the Defense Committee advised Moore to cut off all contact with Italian authorities, and when Vellicani insisted that a formal diplomatic protest be lodged in Washington and Rome, Ferranti told him that was impossible. In March, after Mucci raised further questions in Parliament, Ferranti asked Moore to try to stop his criticisms of the American legal system. Nevertheless, as Sacco and Vanzetti awaited the outcome of appeals and motions, Ferranti acted on his own initiative to aid the defense by soothing public opinion in Boston. To counter Sacco and Vanzetti's radical profile, Rolando Ricci began to employ the same nationalist strategy adopted by Mussolini, declaring in a speech in Philadelphia that he was responsible for acting as a guardian of the Italian colonies in the United States, implying thereby that such protection was needed. But while the statement drew sharp criticism from the American press and an apology from Rome, the ambassador assured his superiors that he would continue to assist Sacco and Vanzetti for the dignity of the good Italian name. La Notizia, the Boston newspaper for which Aldino Felicani worked, quoted him as saying that the conviction of Sacco and Vanzetti had as much to do with their being Italian as with their being anarchists. Mussolini was concerned that Rolando Ricci's Philadelphia remarks had damaged relations with Washington, and when he became prime minister on October 29, 1922, he appointed a new ambassador, Prince Galeazzo Caetani. Mussolini had actually made clear his desire for friendship with Washington, even before he assumed power. The day he arrived in Rome to form his government, he told foreign journalists that war debts and immigration policy were the two main issues in Italian-American relations, and he wrote to Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes of his desire for close economic cooperation between the two countries. Over the next several years, the new premier sought to lift restrictions on Italian immigration imposed by the Immigration Act of 1921 and to secure American loans. In the first years of his government, Mussolini's treatment of the anarchist movement was distinguished from that of the previous government only by the violence of the blackshirts. On October 29, 1922, while small bands of anarchists fought to keep the squadristi from occupying Rome, in Piazza Cavour, fascists mounted a picture of Malatesta on bayonets and burned it. The following night, blackshirts broke into the offices of Umanità Nova and partially wrecked the presses, a task completed later in a second assault. Malatesta managed to put out 2 additional issues of the paper, both of which containing blistering attacks on Mussolini, before it was closed down permanently. Malatesta himself was not personally harmed, but with his paper gone, he had now, at the age of 69, to make a living once again by working as an electrical mechanic. For the rest of his life, he remained under constant police surveillance. Hardly was Mussolini in office when the Sacco-Vanzetti case forced itself on his attention. On December 4th, Vanzetti's sister, Luigia, addressed a petition to him. "It is true," she wrote, that as the accused are subversives, they cannot have their sympathy, but we believe that justice must be practiced above all ideas and all parties. At the same time, one of the 3 Macchinerni brothers, assisting Fred Moore, went to Rome to ask Mussolini's government for help. Ambassador Caetani was ordered to approach both federal and Massachusetts officials in favor of our fellow countrymen. But in view of recent proposals to restrict immigration further, Caetani advised Mussolini not to make a major point of contention out of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were hardly the kind of Italians that American officials wanted in their country. Mussolini's coming to power divided the Italian immigration community in the United States. Italian-American fascists were as politically reactionary as their counterparts in Italy. Agostino de Biasi, who founded the first fascio in the United States as early as 1921, used his journal, Il Carroccio, New York, to attack immigrant subversives, as brutally as did the American authorities, and carried only brief factual notices about the case. Domenico Trombetta, himself a former anarchist, followed suit in his Grido della Stripe, New York. But while the leftist papers pounded away at the fascists, only the anarchist La Donata dei Refrattari and Il Martello stood unflinchingly by Sacco and Vanzetti. The mainstream Italian-language press took the more cautious positions of New York's Il Progresso Italo-Americano, the largest circulation Italian paper, which condemned Sacco and Vanzetti's political ideas but expressed solidarity for fellow Italians falsely accused. The rise of nationalist sentiment among Italian Americans in the 1920s, fueled by fascist propaganda, encouraged many immigrants to rally behind Sacco and Vanzetti, while simultaneously exalting Mussolini. One exception occurred on March 4, 1923, at a Sacco-Vanzetti rally in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where someone in the audience shouted, "Down with Italy, down with fascism," a fight then erupted between fascists and anti-fascists, during which the head of the local Italian Veterans Organization was wounded. As in Italy, violent clashes between fascists and Sacco and Vanzetti activists in the United States worried Mussolini, for they raised American fears of fascism and threatened to disrupt the good rapport he hoped to establish with Washington. When Caetani urged Mussolini to bring the American fasci under centralized control from Rome, Mussolini went further by assuring the United States that he would close down all the fasci in North America, rather than damage relations between the two countries. Helping to make the Sacco-Vanzetti case an Italian rather than an ideological issue for Mussolini was Italian journalist Luigi Barzini. In December 1922, Barzini, who had not yet declared himself a fascist, had founded an Italian daily in New York, Il Corriere d'America. In March 1923, Barzini threw the paper behind the defense, noting that whatever ideas Sacco and Vanzetti have are unimportant. He urged the creation of an Italian-American United Front and persuaded State Senator Salvatore Cotillo and Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia to help the defense. Barzini then accused the Defense Committee of being interested only in subversive propaganda, and he formed a committee of his own, the Comitato Pro Sacco-Vanzetti, run by a group of conservative Italian-American prominenti. Giovanni de Silvestro, one of the Comitato's vice presidents and a former socialist turned fascist, brought the membership of the Sons of Italy behind the defense. These efforts by conservative Italian-Americans even prompted support from Carlo Barsotti, publisher of Il Progresso. Word soon reached Italy that Sacco, after going on hunger strike and attempting suicide, was confined to the Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane. Deputies Mucci and Constantino Lazzari responded to his news by presenting Mussolini with a harshly worded parliamentary question demanding to know what he had done to help our fellow countrymen, Vanzetti and Sacco. Mussolini wired immediately to Washington for an update on the case and was told that if the defense motions were turned down, there would be an appeal to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Then there would remain, Caetani noted, the possibility of asking the governor of the state for a pardon. The fall of Caetani made two direct efforts to influence the case. The ambassador sent Senator Henry Cabot Lodge a personal request that he use his influence with Massachusetts officials on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti. Lodge refused. The next month, Caetani went to the White House, but Coolidge, in a thinly veiled allusion to Thayer, lectured the ambassador on the impropriety of suggesting that Massachusetts judges were biased. Caetani cautioned Mussolini that Coolidge gave him to understand that any action by the embassy in the case would not be viewed favorably. In any event, Caetani would not have taken their step had he thought Mussolini would object. When Mussolini answered parliamentary questions in December, he took Mucci and Lazzari to task for not having posed it. In those respectful terms, that should be used for a friendly nation such as the United States of America. Failing to mention Caetani's contacts with either Lodge or Coolidge, Mussolini explained that the federal government had no power over state courts, and that any move by Italy in the case would be considered an unwarranted interference in the internal affairs of the United States. He assured Parliament, however, that the government would help Sacco-Vanzetti with actions that were compatible with international usage and would be helpful to our fellow countrymen. He also warned against further demonstrations. For the next 2 years, public attention died down as the state entered a prolonged phase of legal maneuvers in the Massachusetts courts. These efforts culminated in October 1924 in Judge Thayer's denial of all defense motions and his infamous remark, "Did you see what I did with those anarchistic bastards the other day?" Anxious to know whether the moment had come to ask the governor to grant a pardon, Mussolini telegraphed Washington to learn whether the case would go to the state Supreme Court. The legal defense, now headed by William G. Thompson, took the case to the Supreme Judicial Court, which did not rule until the spring of 1926. The same period saw Mussolini faced with major preoccupations at home. The murder of socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti in the summer of 1924 took the fascist regime, leading Mussolini, to declare a dictatorship and unleash a new wave of black shirt violence against his opposition. The fascist reign of terror was vividly described to the Defense Committee by a friend of Falcani, living in Italy. In November 1925, after the regime was stabilized, Finance Minister Giuseppe Volpi de Misurata went to the United States to arrange settlement of Italian war debts and to discuss private loans from American banks. Concerned not to offend American sensibilities, Volpi advised Mussolini, as Caetani had done earlier, to control the fascists in the United States and abandon efforts to help Sacco-Vanzetti. In January, J.P. Morgan Company announced a $100 million loan to Italy. The case came back into public focus on May 12, 1926, when the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts denied the defense's appeal. Taking the high ground, Vanzetti wrote to Malatesta that he not be pained for us. No comrade should fear our fate. Continue the sacred struggle for a truer justice, for liberty. We will know how to face our destiny. In Italy, Sacco-Vanzetti's anarchist comrades joined forces once again with socialists, communists, and Republicans in another round of protests, now seeking to obtain signatures on petitions to be sent to the American embassy, asking for a new trial. Malatesta, who was most likely drafted the petition, suggested that the ambassador not view the request as either a political statement or an offense against the dignity of the nation you represent, but simply as an act of solidarity with the legal defense in Massachusetts. Nevertheless, when the communist paper La Unita published appeals for signatures on the petitions, the police confiscated the issue, no doubt in response to American ambassadors Henry P. Fletcher complaints about these activities. Although Mussolini tightened his grip on the anarchists in 1926, meetings and protests continued throughout the summer. In defiance of the new repression, Malatesta published a portion of Vanzetti's letter in Pensiero e Volonta, a new bi-monthly first issued in January 1924. However, the police confiscated the issue before it could be released, along with copies of the petitions. Fascist agents searched Malatesta's apartment and seized both Vanzetti's letter and a bust of Matteotti. Thereafter, Malatesta remained virtually under house arrest. The police also began periodic searches of the Vanzetti family home in Villa Folletto in Torre Maggiore. Sacco's brother Sabino was placed under surveillance. Upon learning that the Supreme Judicial Court had turned down the appeal, Giacomo de Martino, who had replaced Caetani as ambassador to Washington in January 1925, advised Mussolini that the radicals had so prejudiced American opinion against Sacco-Vanzetti that even a request for a pardon would probably be denied. But Mussolini, pressured by still another deputy and the renewal of protests in Italy, wired back. Let me know if you think it possible to take steps to obtain a pardon for the condemned. DiMartino spoke with the State Department official about the matter, but was told that it was outside federal jurisdiction. DiMartino added that although Massachusetts authorities seemed determined not to give in to pressure from radicals, he could speak privately with members of the U.S. Supreme Court if the case were appealed to them. Dino Grandi, undersecretary at the Foreign Ministry, scrawled across the ambassador's report, telegraphed DiMartino to take steps in Boston. Mussolini added his own instructions, authorizing DiMartino to contact U.S. Supreme Court justices if the case went before the federal bench. But while Mussolini was fully prepared to intervene on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti, action by the Italian government was now strongly discouraged by defense attorney William Thompson, who feared a reaction from American officials. From Boston, Ferranti reiterated the bleak outlook, citing the rigid, inflexible character of Governor Fuller of Massachusetts. In a long meeting on June 26, Thompson told Ferranti that no request should be made for a pardon until all legal avenues had been exhausted. When Ferranti asked whether an Italian approach to federal justices would be useful should the case go to Supreme Court, Thompson warned adamantly against any such efforts. Nevertheless, DiMartino seemed anxious for concrete action and advised Mussolini that he was prepared to act in concert with the defense should the need arise for last-minute maneuvers. The next month, while vacationing in Italy, DiMartino told a reporter in L'impero that he had been working on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti because they were Italians and because they were innocent. A career diplomat, DiMartino would never have made such a statement except by calculation, knowing full well that his remarks would be monitored by the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Before DiMartino returned to Washington, an article in the Paris edition of the Herald Tribune announced that Sacco and Vanzetti were to be executed in 2 days. Mussolini seemed worried until the Washington Embassy assured him that the story was untrue, and Grandi rushed a correction to all prefects in order to forestall radical protests. As the date for Thayer's ruling on a defense motion approached, DiMartino had one of his deputies speak with Assistant Secretary of State Joseph Grew. Grew was told that, although the Italian government respected the principle of judicial independence, Rome wished to underscore the importance that the case held for Italians, many of whom had long assumed the innocence of the defendants. Twice during the last months of 1926, anarchists tried to assassinate Mussolini, who responded by intensifying the campaign against them and virtually crushing the movement. He also instituted new mechanisms for repression, including the Special Tribunal for the Defense of the State, and the reinstatement of the death penalty for assassination attempts against the king or the head of government. Yet Mussolini still persisted in trying to help Sacco and Vanzetti. In October, news that Thayer had denied the defense motion was reported in the semi-official newspapers Il Popolo di Roma and Il Giornale d'Italia, sparking new protests on both sides of the Atlantic. Radicals in Italy were now under severe restrictions, but in the United States, a massive rally was organized in November at New York's Madison Square Garden by the Communist Sacco and Vanzetti Emergency Committee. Speakers included Norman Thompson and Arthur Garfield Hayes. LaGuardia sent a telegram of endorsement but did not attend. As 1927 opened, the pace of events intensified. In January, Thompson appealed the case once again to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. April, however, brought another defeat. On the 9th, Thayer sentenced Sacco and Vanzetti to death by electrocution, the original execution date of July 10th eventually being moved to August 23rd. While cries of outrage arose again throughout Europe, Ferranti and DiMartino now believed that the only hope lay with President Coolidge, who might be able to influence Fuller to grant a pardon. DeMartino suggested that he meet with Coolidge for this purpose, and Mussolini telegraphed on April 9th, "By all means approach the President of the United States on behalf of Sacco-Vanzetti." Meanwhile, the Defense Committee, which Ferranti described to Mussolini for the first time as being full of ardent anti-fascists, asked Fuller to form a special advisory committee to look into the conduct of the trial. On June 1st, after Vanzetti sent the governor a petition for clemency, the so-called Lowell Committee was appointed. Ferranti grew more optimistic, especially when the governor invited him to a private meeting to discuss the case on July 20th. At the end of an hour and a half, Ferranti left Fuller with the thought that Sacco and Vanzetti had surely suffered enough during 7 years of imprisonment. Later that same day, Ferranti appeared at the request of the Defense Counsel before the Lowell Committee, where he made an eloquent, if unofficial, plea on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti. After his testimony, Ferranti invited the governor's secretary, Herman MacDonald, to lunch, a move that had Thompson and fellow attorney Herbert Ehrman wondering whether the consul intended to convey to Fuller a secret message from Mussolini. But apparently they were unaware of the meeting earlier that day. In fact, news of Ferranti's meeting with Fuller encouraged Mussolini, who on July 23rd wired instructions that his personal views should be conveyed to the governor. "My opinion is that the governor could commute the sentence and release our nationals from the terrible circumstance in which they have languished for so many years. While I do not believe that clemency would mean a victory for the subversives, it is certain that the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti would provide the pretext for a vast and continuous subversive agitation throughout the world. The fascist government, which is strongly authoritarian and does not give quarter to the Bolsheviks, very often employs clemency in individual cases. The governor of Massachusetts should not lose the opportunity for a humanitarian act, whose repercussions would be especially positive in Italy." The governor, Ferranti reported to Mussolini, refrained from making any comment. Without waiting for a reply either from Fuller or from his earlier telegram to DeMartino, Mussolini had already drafted his letter of July 24th to Ambassador Fletcher, stressing that his plea was strictly personal. Mussolini authorized Fletcher to make use of it in any way that he thought best. Fletcher, whose private diary speaks of Mussolini as a man whom I like and admire very much, immediately sent a translation of the letter to Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, and the following morning wired Kellogg for instructions as to a response. Kellogg's answer was stiff. Fletcher was to make only a personal and entirely informal oral communication, stating that the subject matter is one over which the federal government has no jurisdiction or control. The Prime Minister's letter was forwarded to Boston. As the date for the executions approached, the defense filed further motions and appeals in the Massachusetts court and a number of writs before justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. In early August, after the Lowell Committee issued its findings, Fuller refused to grant clemency. DeMartino detailed for Mussolini the decisively negative atmosphere he encountered in the White House and the State Department, reporting that Undersecretary Grew had insisted that the threat of radical agitation could not be allowed to influence the U.S. government. Assistant Secretary of State Castle told DeMartino that there was no question of Sacco and Vanzetti's guilt, and that the Defense Counsel had stirred up demonstrations abroad in order to secure financial contributions for their legal fees. In a subsequent talk, Castle argued that the government could not possibly give in to mob rule and to the pressure orchestrated from Moscow. DeMartino concluded that there was no hope. In such an irreducibly hostile ambience, everything possible has been done. In Boston, Ferranti spoke with Fuller's secretary and other highly placed persons, making it clear that Mussolini would be willing to appeal personally to the government. But everyone advised me in no uncertain terms against any further action. which could not fail to encounter a categorical refusal. Although the efforts of Mussolini and his representatives had been made discreetly, the press detected signs of activity. On August 5th, Michel Sacco sent Mussolini a moving appeal to help save his son. Mussolini published the letter in his official newspaper along with his reply. For some time, he explained, I have occupied myself assiduously with the situation of Sacco and Vanzetti, and have done everything possible, compatible with international law, to save them from execution. Unaware of Mussolini's behind-the-scenes actions, on August 9th, a desperate defense committee cabled its own disguised plea to Mussolini. As head of the Italian nation, we address to you an appeal from the depths of our hearts in behalf of our two countrymen. A word from you will do more than that of anyone else to prevent the completion of this tragic injustice and the consequent upsetting of international relations. In Italy, the underground anarchist and communist movements reacted to these events by distributing leaflets attacking the complicity of the fascist regime from American capitalism, and blaming Mussolini for not registering a formal protest with the U.S. government. Letters, newspaper articles, songs, and other propaganda materials were smuggled into Italy by anarchist comrades in the United States, although much of this material was confiscated by the police. In large industrial cities like Turin, small rural villages, printed handbills and handwritten leaflets were distributed calling for death to Governor Fuller, and one handbill purportedly quoted a letter from Vanzetti to Mexican anarchists, saying, I am convinced that any other man at the head of the Italian state would be enough to save us. Until now, the Italian press, kept under tight control by Mussolini, had carefully restrained in its reporting of the case. But in a deliberate effort by Mussolini to pressure the Americans, major newspapers began to express what Eugene Lyons called a curiously muffled excitement. Il Popolo d'Italia even sent a reporter to Torre Maggiore, where he interviewed Sacco's father and brother Sabino and found the village confident that Mussolini and the fascist government would do all possible to save the condemned men. La Stampa of Turin published a favorable interview with a childhood friend of Vanzetti, and while visiting Vanzetti's home in Vallafoletto and Sacco's family in Torre Maggiore, the American anti-fascist journalist Gertrude Winslow found that we need to have no fear of fascism as far as our errand was concerned. All factions were one in their sympathy for the two condemned Italians. While Il Giornale d'Italia printed a statement by Giuseppe Andrauer, who had testified that he had seen Sacco in the Italian consulate in Boston on the day he was supposed to have taken part in the South Braintree crime. La Tribuna did an interview with Count Ignazio Theon de Revel, head of the Fascist League of North America. De Revel asserted that while fascists were ready to fight to the death against the political ideas of Sacco and Vanzetti, he too had appealed to Governor Fuller. Statements of support also appeared in Il Telvari and Il Messaggero. In the United States, an unnamed source revealed to the New York Times that Mussolini had written a personal letter on behalf of the defendants, but the embassy denied emphatically that it had been instructed to make a formal protest against the execution. These efforts, together with last-minute legal moves, were to no avail. On August 21st, 10,000 protesters gathered in New York's Union Square, while in Boston, crowds were dispersed by the police. On August 22nd, as Fuller refused to stay the execution, the Italian ambassador had a last meeting with Kellogg. DeMartino asked the Secretary of State about the latest developments and whether the case possibly came within the jurisdiction of the U.S. Supreme Court. When he again raised the specter of radical agitation, Kellogg replied blandly, "If they had not been members of an anarchist group, they would have been hung years ago." Shortly past midnight, Ferranti wired Mussolini. Execution took place a few moments ago. In Rome, people stood in stunned silence outside newspaper offices, which were now permitted to editorialize about the case and criticize the United States. Some papers attributed Fuller's crime to the mechanistic, anti-humanistic nature of American civilization and underscored the irony of a fascist government trying to save the lives of two anarchists. A few blamed the executions on the radical protests, but only the intransigent Roberto Farinacci's Il Regime Fascista thought the two anarchists deserved their fate. Mussolini's personal reaction to the executions is unknown, but Arnaldo Mussolini, editor of Il Popolo d'Italia, spoke for his brother when he attacked the inflexible American government, contrasting it with the Italian system that had allowed Violet Gibson, the Anglo-Irish woman who had tried to kill Mussolini, to return to her own country. Political calculation and diplomatic tact had caused Mussolini to vary the intensity of his public support for Sacco-Vanzetti. Between 1920 and 1922, he saw their plight as a useful weapon in his struggle against the socialists and the communists. And when he saw the potential for making them a nationalist symbol, he appropriated their cause. After coming into office, he believed that support for Sacco and Vanzetti would help to bind Italian-American loyalties to the fascist regime, which claimed to act as the protector of Italian emigrants abroad. Yet once in power, Mussolini felt unable to act as decisively as he wished, because the case could potentially hinder efforts to establish good relations with the United States and hurt chances of American loans and a more favorable immigration policy. A more strident approach, he feared, would elicit the ire of U.S. authorities, including Governor Fuller, whose presidential aspirations had come to his attention. Even the anarchists recognized his delicate position, and Mussolini himself was embittered by his dilemma. But raison d'etre alone does not explain why Mussolini, even while cracking down on the anarchists at home, strained his ideological credibility as a fascist and put his prestige at risk by making personal appeals on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti. The evidence also suggests that a lingering, if perverse, nostalgia for what he identified as his own youthful anarchist impulses remained embedded in his psyche. His propensity for violence and direct action, along with his inclination to see himself as a rebel who lived in defiance of bourgeois morality, led him to feel a spiritual kinship with the anarchists. The anti-fascist writer Giuseppe A. Borghese explained Mussolini this way. He said that every anarchist is a dictator who failed. His road to greatness consisted in making of the anarchist who failed in him the dictator who won. As a true anarchist, Malatesta, who never thought of Mussolini as a genuine revolutionary, saw the matter differently. It's the same old story, he said, of the brigand who becomes the policeman.
The year it is 1927, and the day is the 3rd day of May. Town is a city called Boston, and our address is Dark Dedham Jail. To your honor, the Governor Fuller, to the Council of Massachusetts State, we Bartolomeo Vanzetti and Nicola Sacco do say, confined to our jail here at Dedham, and under the sentence of death, we pray you to exercise your powers and look at the facts of our case. We do not ask you for a pardon, for a pardon would admit of our guilt. Since we are both innocent workers, we have no guilt to admit. We are both born by parents in Italy, can't speak English too well. Our friends of labor are writing these words back of the bars in our cell. Our friends say if we speak too plain, sir, we may turn your feelings away, widen these canyons between us, but we risk our life to talk plain. We think, sir, that each human being is in close touch with all of mankind. Think, sir, that each human being knows right from the wrong in his mind. We talk to you here as a man, sir, even knowing our opinions divide. We didn't kill the guards at South Braintree, nor dream of such a terrible crime. We call your eye to this fact, sir. We work with our hand and our brain. These robberies and killings were done, sir, by professional bandit men. Sacco has been a good cutter. Miss Sacco their money has saved. Vanzetti, I could have saved money, but I gave it as fast as received. I'm a dreamer, a speaker, and a writer. I fight on the working folks' side. Sacco is Boston's fastest shoe trimmer, and he talks to the husbands and wives. We hunted your land and we found it. Hoped we'd find freedom of mind. Built up your land, this land of the free, and this is what we come to find. If we was the killer's good governor, we'd not be so dumb and so blind to pass out our handbills and make worker speeches out here by the scene of the crime. Those 15,000s of dollars the lawyers and judge said we took. Do we, sir, dress up like a two gentlemen with that much in our pocketbook? Our names on the long list of radicals of the federal government, sir. They said that we needed watching as we peddled our literature. Judge Thayer's mind is made up, sir. When we walked into the court, well, he called us anarchistic bastards, said lots of other things worse. They brought people down there to Brockton to look through the bars of our cell, made us act out the emotions of the killers, and still not so many could tell. Before the trial ever started, the jury foreman did say, and he cussed us and said, damn, they'd ought to hang anyway. Our fatal mistake was carrying our guns, about which we had to tell lies, to keep the police from raiding the homes of workers believing like us. A labor paper or a picture, a letter from a radical friend, an old cheap gun like you keep around home to torture good women and men. We all feared deporting and whipping, torments to make us confess. The place where the workers are meeting, the house, your name and address. Well, the officers said we feared something, which they called a consciousness of guilt. We was afraid of wrecking more homes and seeing more workers' blood spilt. Well, the very first question they asked us was not about killing the clerks, but things about our labor movement and how our trade union works. Oh, how could our jury see clearly when the lawyers and judges and cops called us low-type Italians, said we looked just like regular wops. Draft dodgers, gun packers, anarchists, these vulgar-sounding names blew dust in the eyes of the jurors, the crowd in the courtroom the same. We do not believe, sir, the torture, beatings and killings and pains will lift man's eyes to a highest view and break his bilboes and chains. We believe that you must struggle for freedom. Before your freedom you'll gain freedom from fear, sir, and greed, sir, and your freedom to think higher things. This fight, sir, is not a new battle. We did not make it last night. 'Twas fought by Godwin, Shelley, Piscani, Tolstoy, and Christ. It's bigger than the atoms and the sands of the desert, planets that roll in the sky. Till workers get rid of their robbers, well, it's worser to live than to die. Your Excellency, we're not asking pardon, but asking to be set free, with liberty and pride, sir, and honor, and a pardon we will not receive. A pardon you give unto criminals who've broken the laws of the land. We don't ask you for pardon, sir, because we are innocent men. Well, if you shake your head no, dear Governor, course our doom it is sealed. We hold up our heads like two sons of men, 7 years in these cells of steel. We walk down this corridor to death, sir, like workers have walked it before, but we'll work in our working class struggle. We live 1,000 lives more.